Welcome everyone and hello. We're now just going to get started. Thank you all so much for joining us for the very first WWF Insiders virtual event. My name is Andrew Wiley and I lead WWF's Partners in Conservation program. In a couple minutes, I'll be introducing Leigh Henry, who will talk to us about the policy issues related to captive tigers. But before I turn it over to Leigh, I want to cover a few housekeeping items to make sure that this virtual event runs smoothly. First of all, for the entire webinar today, you will notice your audio is muted and your video is disabled. And we will, of course, be taking questions for after Leigh's presentation. During the presentation, feel free to type your questions for Leigh into the chat, and those will be sent automatically to all of the panelists. That's our team behind the scenes making today's webinar happen. Thank you, team. We will be monitoring those throughout the presentation, and we will get to as many as we can before we're done. And then just a final note, as you may have heard, we are recording today's webinar so that we can share it later on our website. Okay, so we're going to turn now our attention to tigers. While roughly 3,900 tigers remain in the wild, an estimated 5,000 tigers live in captivity in the United States. Only about 6% of these tigers live in accredited zoos. This is not conservation. Leigh Henry is going to tell us why the existence of captive tigers endangers the survival of wild tigers and what WWF is doing about it. Leigh Henry leads WWF's policy efforts related to wildlife conservation. And since joining WWF in 2001, she's focused heavily on addressing the issues of wildlife crime and marine species protection, and has led WWF's engagement on in the International Whaling Commission and CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. She's played a key role in our efforts to combat illegal tiger trade and is currently leading the WWF Network's efforts to phase out tiger farms. All right, Leigh, it's all yours. Leigh, take it away.
Thanks, Andrew. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. And thank you so much for your invaluable support, especially given the difficult times we're in more than ever right now. We really appreciate you standing by us and continuing to support the important work that we're doing. We are very grateful for you. Whoop. It's a very slow transition. So I will get started. I was asked to do this presentation for you today, given all of the attention around captive tigers in the last month or so, thanks to the phenomenon known as Tiger King. And while Tiger King might be a newer phenomenon, the issue of captive tigers is something that WWF US has been working on since around 2006, when I was still working for Traffic, our wildlife monitoring organization, wildlife trade monitoring organization, and did a report looking at the population of captive tigers in the US and how they're regulated. There's an estimated roughly 5,000 captive tigers in the US. And by comparison, we have about 3,900 remaining in the wild. So in the US alone, we have far more tigers in captivity than remain in the wild. And as Andrew already mentioned, only about 6% of those are in accredited sanctuaries and zoos. The rest are in private hands. So for those of you who saw Tiger King in facilities like those owned by Joe Exotic and Doc Antle, and other roadside zoos and other more questionable facilities, including backyards. It's important to note that that 5,000 number is just an estimate. And the problem is no one government agency in the US regulates these animals. So no one government agency in the United States can say where these animals are, who owns them, when they're sold and traded, or what happens to their valuable parts when they die. So while there are a lot of animal welfare and public safety concerns associated with this problem, WWF's focus is the possible impact that this lack of regulation on our captive tigers has on wild tigers. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But just to say, and I'm sure you're all very well aware that tiger conservation is a top priority for WWF. We are part of a global commitment made in 2010, the last year of the tiger, to double the world's wild tiger population by the next year of the tiger in 2022. We realized that business as usual wasn't going to achieve that very, very ambitious goal. So WWF created the Tigers Alive initiative at that time, which is a global team. And WWF US has dedicated a third of my time to that team to help work on wildlife trade issues. And we're making good progress. We're not there, but we still have 2 years. Compared to the 3,200 tigers we had in the wild in 2010, we have roughly 3,900 today. So we're definitely heading in the right direction. The population trends are going the way we want them to. Southeast Asia remains a little bit problematic, and we have more work to do there, but we're on the right track. And Tigers Alive is looking at different threats and solutions to help further these conservation goals. One of those, of course, is ending tiger trade. And tiger trade and poaching for that trade are the most immediate threat to wild tigers today. And you can see some of that demonstrated here. This is from a Skin and Bones report done by Traffic that looked at tiger trade from 2000 to 2018. And you can see the different amounts in the different countries there. But the main thing to focus on that I think really demonstrates the scale of this trade and the enormity of the threat is that in those 18 years, an equivalent of almost 2,400 tigers were seized. And if you compare that to the 3,900 or roughly 3,900 tigers we have in the wild today, it gives you a good idea of the enormity of the threat that we're talking about here. And it's important to remember that that's only the number of tigers seized. And of course, a lot of illegal trade goes undetected. So that's likely a significant underestimate. So back to the issue of captive tigers in the US and the connection there. I get the question all the time, why we have this large number of tigers in the US and what is it that's so unique in the US that drives people to want to have these tigers? I can't answer that question. I've been working on this for almost 15 years and I still can't answer that question. But one thing we do know is that a lot of it is driven by profit. So many of these facilities breed cats for public interactions, for photo ops, for petting opportunities, and that business requires a constant stream of new cubs to feed it. You can't pet and take a photo with a 600-pound tiger, so this is part of the reason behind the large population of tigers in the US. It's this constant breeding for these facilities that need the cubs to feed the demand that they've created. So this is a particularly high profit and problematic issue in the US. And it's important to remember here too that once these tigers grow up, they become much more expensive to feed and difficult to care for, and also are not generating profit. So what happens to these tigers at that point? And that's always been one of our concerns, that if you have this lack of regulation in the US and no one government agency paying attention to what's happening to these animals, particularly at the point that they die, and what's happening to their incredibly valuable skins and bones that fetch such high prices on the illegal market. The other problem is that a lot of these facilities in the US, as well as the tiger farms in Asia, sell themselves as conservationists and talk about their contributions to conservation. And I think they're really convincing in that messaging. I know friends of mine have come away from these facilities, former colleagues at WWF have come away from visiting these facilities, saying that how excited they were to contribute to tiger conservation. This is not tiger conservation. These tigers can never be returned to the wild. Most of them are inbred in small populations, so they're not healthy. And WWF thinks our priority should always be on protecting and conserving the tigers we already have in the wild. We know that if we give them protection, we know that if we secure their habitat, they will grow. They will repopulate. And we're seeing this now with upward trend in tiger populations in a lot of the countries that we work in. In addition to making progress on tigers in the wild, we're also making progress on the issues in the US. Again, as I mentioned, we've been working on this for well over a decade. We have managed under existing law to have the US Fish and Wildlife Service and USDA put stronger regulations in place so that we can better track tigers, so that there's less opportunity for the public contact opportunities that generate so much of the breeding. But we're not all the way there yet. We need to make sure that there is federal oversight of all of these animals. And that's why we are now supporting the Big Cat Public Safety Act. It's a piece of legislation that we helped draft almost a decade ago, and it's been through a lot of iterations. The current bill before Congress would mandate that any captive tiger had a federal permit, or the facility that it was in had a federal permit, which makes tracking these animals much easier. Because again, we'd be able to answer those questions. Where are these animals? Who owns them? When they're sold and traded, and what happens to their parts when they die? So we have an action up at the moment, an action alert if people haven't seen that yet, to support the Big Cat Public Safety Act. We have about 450,000 supporters at this moment, but our goal is 750,000. So if you haven't signed on to that petition yet, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could. And we will keep working on this issue. It's a hugely important one for tiger conservation. Again, we want to make sure that the US is taking care of issues in our own backyard so that we can continue to be very strong leaders on wildlife trafficking and tiger conservation globally. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Leigh. All right, so now we'll turn our attention to questions that were submitted in the chat. And as a reminder, if you have any questions that come up while Leigh is answering another question, do feel free to continue to add them to the chat, and we're going to do our best to wrap up by about 3:30 today. But if we are still going and all the questions are coming in, we may take a couple extra. If you have to get off the phone or get off the computer at that point, we understand. We're going to do our best to answer them all. So let's get to our first question. So are those tigers seized that you referenced, do they include all wild tigers, or does that also include captive tigers?
So the answer is we don't know, and this is part of the problem with the flow of product coming out of captive facilities. There's not really any way for enforcement officials to determine whether or not products are coming from captive or wild. So it's feeding the same demand, it's feeding the same market. It's difficult to differentiate. But the one thing I will say is that in recent years, instead of seeing just the tiger bones and tiger skins that we've been seeing in the past, we've been seeing a lot more cubs, whether alive or frozen, entering the trade, and it's suspected that those most likely are coming from tiger farms in Asia, because there just aren't that many cubs in the wild that people can be sourcing. So we get some ideas depending on the products and what you see in trade, and we suspect a lot more is coming from the farms. But again, we're really not sure, and there's no official differentiation in that number.
So the next question is a very direct question. Why does the US allow these captive tigers, and why can't we make it illegal?
It's a good question, and one I've been asking for a number of years. So we're working on it. I mean, it's difficult to ban anything in the US, as I'm sure everybody knows. So what we think is really important is to just ensure, again, that there's oversight by one federal agency over all of these animals. Right now, it's this mishmash and patchwork of state, federal, and local laws. So to try to glean information on where these animals are and to ensure that they're being well cared for, to ensure that local law enforcement know where they are, hugely important. I don't know if everyone remembers the incident in Zanesville, Ohio a few years ago, where a man committed suicide and opened all his cages and let out tigers, and I can't remember everything he had, but they were running all over this small town in Ohio, and of course law enforcement officials didn't know how to deal with it. So we're working to clamp down that way and just make sure that we can shrink the population a bit with those tighter regulations and make it more manageable.
All right, next question. Can you expand on how you think keeping tigers in the US impacts conservation of wild tigers?
Sure. It takes a couple steps to get there. It's not an easy one to explain. So as I mentioned, the illegal trade in tigers is the most immediate threat to tigers today. Tigers are poached to feed demand for their parts and products, mainly tiger skins for ornamentation and bones for traditional and folk medicines. One of the solutions to that problem, and they're multifold, there's no silver bullet, is reducing demand for those products. And part of the way you can reduce demand, of course, is to eliminate the market, to make it illegal, to get the product out of reach. Our concern is when you have 5,000 tigers in the US and they're not being well regulated, and some of this was demonstrated, I think, in Tiger King, where you could tell that the animals were getting sent back and forth between facilities. I know one of the owners was killing tigers and it wasn't clear where they were going. Our concern is when you have that large of a population, if that starts feeding into the illegal trade, and it's the illegal trade that is the main threat to wild tigers, that those parts and products may help to at least perpetuate, if not stimulate or increase demand as more and more product becomes available. So it's not a current significant problem. It's more of a perspective issue, and we know that some trade has been happening here and there out of the US, but not at any large scale. And the other angle to that I hadn't mentioned yet is it's not just the trade threat, it's the political liability. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the tiger farms in Asia, but we have about 6,000 tigers in tiger farms in China. And those, of course, are being bred for trade in their parts and products. We've been working for a long time to get that trade shut down. And when you sit in international meetings like CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and put any pressure on China, they flip it back to the US and say, why aren't you putting any pressure on the US? They have as many tigers as we do. Of course, the situations are very different. We're not breeding them for trade in their parts and products, but it's a political liability, and it's important that the US take action and we clean up our own backyard as well.
Great. What is the rationale of non-accredited tiger owners for keeping them?
It's beyond me. I mean, again, it's a question I just haven't been able to answer. I liken it to anybody wanting to have something bigger and better than their neighbor. So there's that aspect. There's also, and I've met a few of these people over the years, I think some of them really do have the best intentions, and they do it because they love tigers. And they just, when they buy the tiger cub, they just have no idea what they're in for when that tiger cub grows up. I don't know if anyone remembers the news. It was many, many years ago. There was a tiger in an apartment in Brooklyn. I think it was in Brooklyn. It was in New York City somewhere. And they had the firefighters coming down to get it, and this great image of the tiger at the window. And this guy had bought it as a cub, brought it into his apartment in New York City, and then had to evacuate his apartment because he had a full-grown tiger. So I can't explain what drives it.
Has the viewership, the huge viewership of Tiger King, provided an opportunity to pass the big cat protection legislation, or does it potentially harm those efforts? And what has WWF done to leverage this newfound interest?
So we hope it's going to help. I wish in a perfect world that Tiger King had explored a little bit more of the conservation and welfare and public safety issues behind all of these captive tigers. But as with any good filmmaker, I guess they went with what was going to sell best, and the personalities in that show obviously sell better than the conservation issues. So a couple of things we've been doing. We're trying to ride the wave. We placed an op-ed in The Hill, which is a paper read by a lot of lawmakers here in DC, on why it's important to pass the Big Cat Public Safety Act. In that one, we also focused on this political issue with China and the US needing to play a leadership role and lead the way with China on this one. We have, as I mentioned, the petition up, the Action Alert on Big Cat Public Safety Act, to drive support there. And of course, we have a huge government relations staff. Well, I shouldn't say huge, it's a few people. They just do the work of many people. A government relations staff that's on the Hill all the time. They're advocating this every time they're up there, hoping to push it. So just trying to get the word out and drive support. Um, I think the bill we have before Congress now is much more politically viable than what we had in the past. It's a reasonable approach. So really hoping we can generate support and get it through this Congress.
And at the end, we're definitely going to share the link for the petition so that people who are listening to this chat will be able to sign on to that if they haven't already. All right, we have time for a few more questions. Next one is, how much success have we had at reducing the demand for tiger parts? What are the initiatives geared towards that beyond reducing captive tiger breeding populations?
So, as Andrew mentioned at the beginning, I've worked in WWF since 2001, so I have a lot of history on this, and I haven't worked on tigers consistently since that time. But the demand reduction work is a little bit newer in the time scale of conservation, so it's something we're still learning about. And there are a couple ways to go about it. One, of course, is law enforcement. You have laws passed that ban trade in tigers, which most countries have in place, and it's banned internationally. And then enforcing that and being very clear about the laws and showing enforcement is being implemented is one deterrent. Then also just finding different ways to target behavior change. So we work on law enforcement quite a bit. We do capacity building. We work with the judiciary to help with prosecutions so they know how to handle case management, so that there's that angle of our work. We also, many years ago, started work with the traditional Chinese medicine community. That, of course, doesn't get at all of the demand, but tiger and rhino bone and horn were both removed from the official traditional Chinese medicine pharmacopoeia a number of years ago. But traditional medicine is a centuries-old practice that is very deeply rooted in Chinese culture and other Asian cultures as well. So it's just going to take a long time to get there. So we're focused on the law enforcement demand reduction aspect, and also behavior change, and trying to root out some of that demand. But it's a difficult one.
Mm-hmm. If the Big Cat Public Safety Act passes, which federal agency would be responsible for enforcing it? Is it Fish and Wildlife?
It actually would be more under USDA. So APHIS, the Animal Plant and Health Inspection Service. USDA authorizes the permits that will be required under the Big Cat Public Safety Act. And the Big Cat Public Safety Act also will ban public contact. That will also be overseen by USDA. So it mandates, I think it's a 15-foot distance between visitors and big cats. So mainly that's overseen by USDA.
Is there anything that can be done with the captive tiger parts after they die?
Our preference would be to see them destroyed. I mean, that's the most efficient and effective way to ensure that they don't end up in illegal trade. There has been some work in the past to require that destruction happen. When they're seized, sometimes that happens, but we haven't been able to get there yet. And again, that's probably a next step in the process. We first need to ensure that there's federal regulation over all of these animals, and then we can start to work on how that's implemented in the regulations under that, and hopefully then we can get some control over what happens to tigers after they've died and how they're disposed of.
This is a good question. Is there an association of zoos in the US? And if so, are they helping with this problem?
Yep. So the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, they provide, they're kind of an overseeing body of zoos, and the zoos that belong to AZA have to meet certain rigorous qualifications. I don't know all those qualifications because I'm not a zoo expert, but those are the legitimate zoos. I mean, a lot of facilities might use the name zoo, but if it's an AZA accredited zoo, then you know they're doing good work. They're caring for animals the way they should. They are looking at conservation and how they can contribute to conservation. And there was a second part to that question, I think, wasn't there?
How is the AZA helping with the problem?
Yes. So AZA, interestingly, AZA is now headed by Dan Ash, the former head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is who I was lobbying for some of the regulatory changes needed under the Endangered Species Act at the time. So now he's head of AZA. AZA is also a supporter of the Big Cat Public Safety Act. They have also come on board to back us on trying to phase out Asian tiger farms and on communicating the message that Asian tiger farms are not conservation facilities. It's not conservation breeding. That happens in very few facilities with specific conservation breeding programs, usually in AZA or WAZA, which is the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, accredited facilities. So they're on board and helping out.
That's great. All right, we have time for one or two, maybe more questions. So my next question. My understanding is that the Chinese government still includes tiger bones in its official traditional medicine training and books. If that is true, what are we doing to change that?
So tiger bone was removed from the official traditional medicine pharmacopoeia in the 1990s, but it was just tiger bone. And really, so there are some different aspects to this. Really, in traditional Chinese medicine, it's been eliminated. That doesn't mean it's never used. It's a long-held tradition. But beyond that, and really the use there was mainly bone. But beyond that, there are extrapolations from traditional medicine and more kind of folk medicines that use virtually every part of the tiger's body. So China may ban tiger bone, but that doesn't mean that they can't use other parts of tigers. Until the last year or so, I'm not sure if everybody saw the news that China proposed to reopen trade in tiger parts out of their farms, specifically to traditional medicine hospitals. So they weren't looking to reopen a broad trade, but they were looking to reopen trade out of farms directly to traditional medicine practitioners and hospitals. WWF spoke out in strong opposition to that. It was reversed very quickly. And since that time, they have had in place a ban on trade in all tiger products, but it's very vague and unclear, and we understand it's not permanent. So we're working to make sure that the Chinese government makes that ban on all parts and products of tigers from any source, whether wild or farmed, illegal, and that they communicate that message very clearly. Because right now it's still kind of vague and foggy and not clearly messaged.
All right, last final question before we wrap it up. If the BCPSA, the Big Cat Public Safety Act, passes, what consequences will violators face?
Now I'm trying to remember. Well, their tigers would be seized. So if you're found to have a tiger and it doesn't have the required federal permit, the tiger would be seized. That's an issue in itself because tiger sanctuaries are full to overflowing. So we need to figure out where they're going and that sanctuaries are able to take them. And I'm trying to remember now what the maximum penalty was. I think it was a $20,000 fine, up to $20,000 fine. I might have to check that, but I think that's what it was.
Well, we can certainly look into that and share that after. So that's going to do it for our discussion this afternoon. Thanks again, Leigh, for sharing all of your insights with us today. And thanks to everyone who joined us on this Zoom. We are glad that you carved out time in your schedules to participate in our very first virtual event for WWF Insiders. As I said before, we're going to be following up by email with a link to the advocacy action to support the Big Cat Public Safety Act. And we're also going to include a survey about your experience on today's webinar, because this was our first foray into the virtual event space, and we just want to make sure that we adjust and improve where we can. So please do be honest with us. Finally, please mark your calendars for the next installments of the WWF Insiders virtual event series. The second episode will be on Thursday, May 7th, 2 weeks from today, and will feature Jeanette Hemley, WWF Senior Vice President for Wildlife Conservation, and Jan Verdefe, our Wildlife Conservation Senior Advisor, speaking out about zoonotic diseases and wildlife trade. And then our third episode will be 2 weeks from that on May 21st, and will feature Anita Van Breda, WWF Senior Director for Environment and Disaster Management, on our response to environmental emergencies such as the recent fires in the Amazon and in Australia. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you.